The winter meetings are over. A lot of players were signed, but none by the Orioles. So as everyone gets back from San Diego, today we answer the question, which free agents are still left out there for the Orioles to go after? That's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Friday, December 9th, 2022, and welcome back in to the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to take a look at the free agents that are still out there for the Orioles to go after. Because, listen, after the O's signed Kyle Gibson to a one-year deal last Saturday, they didn't sign anyone to a major league deal during the winter meetings in San Diego this week, where, as we know, a lot of other teams were very active. So it's been a little frustrating, but just want to be here to let you know there are still free agents out there, still impact free agents out there that the Orioles could bring in to make this team better and a playoff contender heading into 2023. So we'll talk about the starting pitchers, talk about the left-handed hitters, and then at the end of the pod, I'll give some thoughts about kind of the Mike Elias, Angelos family fan relationship right now, what the things are Elias is saying and how it's impacting the Orioles' future. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Bet Online. Bet Online has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online, where the game starts. So we jump right into it here on a Free Agent Friday episode of the podcast. And listen, the Orioles have only brought in one free agent, at least at the major league level. 1 year, $10 million for Kyle Gibson to kind of sit as that number 4 or 5 starter in their rotation, but they need to do more. And we know that. And many reports, whether they're coming from local media, national media, or from Mike Elias himself, say the Orioles are going to do more, whether it's a left-handed hitter, a catcher, another pitcher, probably all three. It seems like it's going to happen. But I have to admit, I'm a little frustrated after this week. I know many of you are very frustrated after this week because at the winter meetings in San Diego, we saw so many teams make the big splashes, whether it was the Yankees bringing back Aaron Judge, the Phillies going and getting Trey Turner, the Padres getting Xander Bogaerts, all these big names coming off the board. You had Verlander to the Mets and DeGrom to the Rangers. The big pitchers go off as well. And you're thinking, what are the Orioles doing? And it's frustrating because a lot of other teams are getting things done. But when you think about it, there were more than 20 teams of the 30 that did not make a major league signing at the winter meeting. So the Orioles are not alone at this point. They've done more than some teams at this point because at least they've brought in Kyle Gibson. Some teams have done nothing, even teams that are somewhat competing so far this offseason. But it's still frustrating. I'm frustrated. I would have liked for them to make one of those splash moves. But today's episode, at least a good chunk of it, is about how there's still guys out there that the Orioles are targeting. And you could argue that maybe the 2 dream free agents for the Orioles are still on the board as well, which should give you just a little bit of hope. So let's take a look at which free agents are still out there for the Orioles to go after. And let's start with the starting pitchers, because as we know, the Orioles, as I mentioned a couple times, already brought in Kyle Gibson on a 1-year deal. He'll sit in the 4 or 5 spot in the rotation, but they need to get another pitcher. And we know they have Grayson Rodriguez coming up and DL Hall ready to start. You add that to good seasons from Kyle Bradish and Dean Kramer and Tyler Wells and Austin Voth and John Means coming back from Tommy John surgery at some point this year. And you feel like you have a solid rotation coming together. But as we've talked about on previous episodes, specifically this week when I broke down the Kyle Gibson signing on Monday's episode, you can't rely on all these guys. And the Orioles' current projected starting rotation, if you take out Kyle Gibson, does not have anyone in it who has at least one full good MLB season. A lot of guys still have a lot to prove, so you have to add to the rotation, and Gibson's not enough. So yes, it was a little disappointing to see Verlander, DeGrom go off the board. I don't think many of us thought that the Orioles, though, would be in on either of those guys. I saw those deals. I said, great for them. They're going to go win probably some more World Series. I mean, good for the Rangers. Love to see that team just continue to spend and make their fans happy and make the team better and better. But when you get down to kind of the next tier, you thought the O's would be in on some of these guys. And it was a little disappointing to see guys like Tyler Anderson and Jamison Tyone and Taijuan Walker and Andrew Haney, all go off the board without the Orioles making the signings. But I listed the top 7 free agent pitchers still available. And the Orioles could and should sign any of these 7 guys. And obviously it starts with Carlos Rodón. Now, we have median projections. John Becker over at Roster Resource at Fangraphs does a great job. He has a spreadsheet that takes all the free agency predictions from all the different outlets, whether it's Fangraphs, Baseball Prospectus, MLB Trade Rumors, whoever it is, and does a median projection. Now, he does these at the beginning of the offseason, and the Rodón median projection was 5 years, $140 million on the contract. He's probably going to get more like 6 years, $180 million, if we're being honest, and we're looking at what the starting pitchers have been making so far in free agency. Some ridiculous deals have been out there. So the O's are going to have to pony up, and we know they've been in on Rodón. John Heyman and others have reported it. They are still talking to Scott Boras about Carlos Rodón. I'm skeptical they're going to give out that big of a deal, but I mean, you're going to get a guy who threw about 180 innings this year, had a 2.88 ERA, had a 2.25 FIP, had about 12 Ks per nine, was just dominant for the Giants this season, and is bar none with DeGrom and Verlander signed the best free agent starting pitcher out there. And he's the last of the 3 aces who are available this offseason. So I think that's the splash the Orioles could and should make. But if they don't, there's still some names below Rodón. Now, these guys are a tier below, but I would say the next best option would be Chris Bassitt. Now, that initial median prediction was 3 years, $60 million on the Chris Bassitt contract. When you look at the fact that Taijuan Walker got 4 years, $72 million, Chris Bassitt is probably looking for something more in the range of 4 years, $100 million instead of 3 years, $60 million. Now, I don't know if he's going to get that. He's 34 years old, but he's going to be looking for that in that free agent market. And he does have the qualifying offer attached to him. The Orioles would have to give up about a 3rd-round draft pick to get him, but 180 innings, 3.42 ERA, 3.66 FIP, good stuff, good track record, kind of a late bloomer, maybe still has his best stuff ahead of him. I'd go get Chris Bassitt. Again, he wouldn't be the ace that Carlos Rodón would be, but you could start Chris Bassitt on opening day and feel good about that. So those 2 guys are still out there. And then the 3rd guy who I think you could feel confident starting opening day still, Kodai Senga is still out there. Coming over from Japan this year, an incredible dominant decade in the MPB. Again, median projection was about 5 years, $80 million. You could probably bump that up to at least 5 years, $100 million, around what he's probably going to get in this market. And there's questions because you've only seen him face NPB hitters. Again, a league that most say is somewhere between AAA and the major leagues in terms of talent. It's the 2nd best professional league in the world. But he had dominant numbers. I mean, a sub-2 ERA for a lot of his career. I think he can still be, he's 30 years old, a top of the rotation guy in the big leagues. And the O's should consider it. Then you go down the line beyond Rodón, Bassitt, and Senga. And you look at guys who, hey, if they return to their peak form, maybe they could be your ace. And these guys would certainly help the Orioles if they signed them. But I think if the offseason was Rodón and Gibson, the pitchers you added, I'd feel great. If the offseason was Bassitt and Gibson, I'd feel good. If the offseason was Senga and Gibson, I'd feel good. Next guy on the list I put was Nathan Eovaldi. He's a guy who started opening day in the past. He's been great for the Red Sox, wasn't as good, had some injuries this year. He's had a long injury history his entire career, a couple of Tommy Johns. You could maybe start him opening day. I'd feel maybe okay if Eovaldi and Gibson was the offseason. His median projection was 2 years, $38 million. I can see him getting something closer to that 3 year, $60 million deal that Chris Bassitt was maybe initially projected for. He only threw 109 innings with the Red Sox this year, a 3.87 ERA, did have a 4.30 FIP. His stuff was still solid, maybe a tick down. I think he's still a good pitcher. I think it was just injury issues this year, and he's back to being healthy. Next guy, I would say Noah Syndergaard. We know the Orioles have met with Syndergaard via Zoom. They did so last week. His projection was 2 years, $23 million. He's probably looking at something more like 2 years, $30 million to bring in Syndergaard. 135 innings for the Angels and Phillies, 3.94 ERA, 3.83 FIP. He's not the Noah Syndergaard he was with the Mets before the Tommy John surgery. He doesn't throw 100 miles per hour anymore, but he's a guy who keeps the pitch count down, can get you 6-7+ innings on any given night. The strikeout numbers aren't as high. We'll see if the stuff gets maybe closer back to what it was now over a year removed from Tommy John when he returns this season. But he's still a nice option. But Syndergaard and Gibson, that's not going to cut it together. You need a third pitcher. Next guy out there, Sean Manaea. He's still out there, left-hander. Median is 2 years, 24. I think, again, he'll get something closer to 2 years, 30+ million. 158 innings for the Padres in his worst big league season, 4.96 ERA, 4.53 FIP in San Diego. The stuff was still there. The command was not. He looked rough at times. He looked like an ace for a while when he was in Oakland before the trade to the Padres this year. I still think he has something in him. I think he's a buy low candidate that would help. But again, I wouldn't be satisfied with just a Manaea Gibson offseason. And then the last guy I'll put on this list is Ross Stripling. I would be really unsatisfied with a Stripling and Gibson offseason. Honestly, I'd rather replace Stripling with Gibson and then get Bassitt, and that's a much better offseason. But the prediction for Stripling was around 2 years, 25 million. That's probably still around what he'll get. Only threw 134 innings with the Blue Jays this year, but did have a 3.01 ERA and a 3.11 FIP, and had, you could argue maybe close to his best season of his career. So a good time for him to hit free agency. Again, another option, but some of those guys aren't as exciting. But I want to be here to tell you, they could still get Rodón. And even if they don't, even if they get Bassitt, I think Bassitt plus Gibson plus the guys they've already got makes this rotation a whole lot better. So right now, I'm holding out hope for Carlos Rodón. I am more level-headed thinking Chris Bassitt could be the guy. And if it's neither of those guys, I think that's when it's a little bit time to panic, because then you're looking at a big trade or bust this offseason for the Orioles. But starting pitching isn't the only thing the O's have said they're targeting this offseason. They are also going after at least one left-handed hitter. And going to go through a similar list of lefties, although just as I was recording here on Thursday night, the best left-handed hitter went off the board. But the Orioles still have some options, and we will get to those options here coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Built Bar, because we got to pause the pod for a second, all right? Because you got to try this. And what do you got to try? Built Bar's new reimagined flavors. We've talked about time and time again on the podcast, all the great flavors they have of their protein bars, but they got the good stuff coming in. Cookie dough topper, coconut brownie bar, and the coconut brownie topper. How about white chocolate peppermint granola? Built's take on the granola bar, so it's more filling and still insanely tasting. How about candy cane brownie? Listen to all these flavors. Great for the holidays, delicious. You got to get your hands on them. And if you haven't tried Built Bars before, they're literally the best tasting protein bars ever built. They're covered in 100% real chocolate, but they're still good for you. 17 grams of protein in every bar, and shockingly, just 130 calories. And you're going to remember the time before you had Built Bars and then after you had Built Bars, because it's magical and it might just change your life. Built Bars, you got to try this. And you can get 15% off your order right now by using the code LOCKEDON15 at Built.com. Again, that is code LOCKEDON15 for 15% off at Built.com. So we're taking a look on today's episode at the free agents still out there for the Orioles to go sign after a disappointing winter meetings where they did not bring in anyone on a major league contract. We talk about the starting pitchers. Now let's pivot to the left-handed hitters, because we know the Orioles could bring in right-handed hitters, certainly. And two of the big four shortstops are still out there. I would love to get Carlos Correa. He's still a free agent. Cooling on Dansby Swanson a little bit, but he'd still be a great player. Of course, as we know, Trey Turner signed a mega deal, 11 years, $300 million with the Phillies. And then late on Wednesday night, Xander Bogaerts, kind of a shocker, mega deal, 11 years, $280 million with the San Diego Padres. So 2 down, still 2 to go with the mega shortstops. And hopefully the O's are in on Correa. Not really sure they are at this point, but they really have said they're targeting more left-handed hitters to take advantage of Camden Yards and get some better lefties in the lineup. They really didn't have kind of the trustworthy lefty in the lineup last year until they called up Gunnar Henderson in September. So when I put together this list, I was doing notes for the podcast on Thursday evening. I put number 1. I thought it was a no-brainer choice that Brandon Nimmo was the number 1 left-handed hitting free agent on the market. Now, he's a center fielder, and the Orioles have Cedric Mullins, but Mullins is a better defender, although Nimmo is pretty great. And if they put Nimmo out there in left field patrolling with the new wall, that would be an amazing outfield defense with Nimmo and Mullins out there. You'd have Nimmo at the top of the lineup. It'd be looking pretty good. Well, then the New York Mets started spending again. And they brought back Brandon Nimmo before I recorded. An 8-year, $162 million deal. Nimmo back to the Mets. Mets also picked up David Robertson to help their bullpen on a 1-year contract on Thursday night as well. So good on the Mets. I mean, that was the guy. A 5.4 WAR according to Fangraphs, a 134 WRC plus last season. The projections were 5 years, $120 million. So, I mean, good for Nimmo. He made more money. He got 8 years on his contract, something his favorite president couldn't do. But, well, then we turn to the next guy on the list. So the lefty I had as my number 2 on the list, who now I guess would be number 1, is Andrew Benintendi. Now, the projections have him at about 4 years, $56 million. I could see that, something around 4 years, maybe $60 to $70 million on the contract that he gets. And Benintendi had an interesting year. You know, he had been with the Red Sox, had the great career, went over to the Royals, wasn't as good, kind of bounced back this year, then was traded to the Yankees, but was injured down the stretch. At the end of the day, 521 plate appearances for Benintendi between Kansas City and New York this year. A 2.8 Fangraphs WAR and a 122 WRC plus meant he was 22% better than a league average hitter this year. I think he got a bad rap with the injuries and kind of a rough year. I still think he's a good hitter. And if the Orioles brought him in, he'd be a good fit. I just don't see them being connected to Benintendi. We really haven't seen any Benintendi rumors at all, it seems like, this offseason. But I don't see the O's going after him. The guy, though, I do see them going after next on the list is the veteran Michael Brantley. Now, he's into his mid to late 30s at this point, but the projections have him getting right around a 1-year, $13 million contract. I think he'll get something closer to 15 to 20 million if he takes a 1-year deal, but you know, he's still a great hitter, and he was injured and he missed most of the season with the Astros, and he did not play in the postseason, got the World Series ring, but didn't help him do it in the playoffs. But early in the year before the injury, 277 plate appearances, 1.2 FWAR. It's because he really doesn't play the field all that well anymore. But a 127 WRC plus still for Michael Brantley. And again, he's mostly a DH/corner outfielder at this point, but the guy can still hit. And kind of his approach, using the whole field, doesn't strike out a lot. Really, you know, that old mantra of a professional hitter, that's Michael Brantley. I think he'd be perfect to really balance this Orioles lineup. He's kind of on the top of my wish list right now, and a guy who should be in the Orioles price range. I mean, he's going to take either a 1 or 2 year deal. I don't think he'll be getting anything more than 2 years. And I mean, at most he'd be getting 20 million a year, but it's probably going to be more like 15 million per year. And the Orioles should immediately try to swing that. I kind of love Michael Brantley on this team. I think he would be a really perfect fit to play some outfield and DH as well. But next guy after Brantley would kind of be an interesting pickup for the Orioles, and that's Jurickson Profar, the one-time number 1 prospect in baseball with the Rangers. Kind of found himself again a little bit with the Padres this year. He played more of the outfield, left field, right field, but he can still play second, shortstop, third base. He plays all around the diamond, so he gives you that versatility. The projection was around a 3-year, $30 million deal. I expect him to get maybe more like 3 years and $40 million on the open market, but he played everywhere, but he played almost every day for the Padres this year. About 650 plate appearances, had a 2.5 Fangraphs WAR, had a 110 WRC plus. So he wasn't anything amazing, but he's a really, really solid utility player who you can play every day, just at kind of varying positions to keep your lineup balanced, get guys in and out of the lineup, get guys some rest. Profar is a really helpful piece on a team. I don't know if he's an impact piece in the lineup, but he's a helpful piece. And I wouldn't be mad seeing him in an Orioles uniform either. 5th on this list, I put Michael Conforto. He's really one of the biggest question marks out there on the free agent market this offseason. I mean, Conforto, who had the shoulder injury, got the surgery, you know, was a free agent last year, never signed, said he'd be healthy around June, and then maybe wasn't as healthy, missed some more time, and then nobody brought him in. He was never signed, didn't play any baseball last year, but now he is fully healthy, and he's still a free agent, and he's trying to find that deal. I think most people think he's going to take a 1-year deal, probably around $15 million on kind of a prove-it deal, you know, to get 1 year, show he's healthy, and then try and get a bigger contract next offseason. But I think the O's could be the perfect place for him to get on that prove-it deal with the shorter wall in right field. I think he can still play the outfield, and he could really help this Orioles team. I mean, the last time we saw him out there in 2021 with the Mets, 479 plate appearances, a 1.4 WAR, just a 106 WRC plus. He certainly was not the best version of himself, but he was playing injured, and then he missed some time with the injury, and he just was not right that season. Before that, he had some really, really good numbers. I think he could get back to that, and I would like to see the O's go after Conforto. And then really the last two guys that are still out there among left-handed hitters, these are not guys you want to pour a lot of money into. They're just like, maybe it'll work out. One's Joey Gallo. The projections around a 1-year, $10 million prove-it deal that he would get. We know what a disaster it was for him with the Yankees this year, gets traded to the Dodgers, ends up with just an 85 WRC plus in 400 plate appearances, can still play the field pretty well, can still hit homers, but he's got to figure out the strikeout issue a little bit. And the other guy I put on is Adam Frazier, only because his projection is only around a 1-year, $5 million deal. He did have 600 plate appearances with the Mariners this season, only a 1.1 WAR, only an 81 WRC plus. He was 19% worse than a league average hitter, but he was in the starting lineup in the playoffs for the Mariners. So at least that's something. And he has been good, especially when he was with the Pirates before the trade. So maybe there's something there if they want to upgrade on Rougned Odor a little bit, but obviously wouldn't be the most exciting signing. But there you go. There's the starting pitchers. There's the left-handed hitters. There is still talent out there. And if the O's are going to spend some money, like Mike Elias has been saying they're going to do at least to some extent, there are still options out there. So don't panic yet. There's going to be a time when maybe you panic, because there could be a time this offseason if the O's don't sign anyone where we're relying on them swinging a big trade for a starter or it's a failed offseason. But we're not there yet. Rodon's out there. Bassitt's out there on the pitching side. Even, guys like Brantley and Benintendi are still out there. And Correa and Swanson still there too. There are still ways to really, really add to this team with big impact guys in free agency. But I think what some of the other frustration is at this point for me, for other Orioles fans, is the things that Mike Elias has said, specifically lately, over the last week at the winter meetings. And after he said that liftoff quote, after trading Mancini and Lopez at the trade deadline, we got excited for this offseason for good reason. But he started to backtrack more and more. And he did it a lot this week. So coming up next to finish off the pod, just want to kind of give my general thoughts on Elias's quotes, the state of the team, the Angelos family, and what it all means for the Orioles moving forward. So a lot of why me and fans have been disappointed this week at the winter meetings with the O's not making a major league signing is because, Mike Elias has gone out there. He's talked to the Orioles media. He's talked to the national media. He's gone on radio shows, different things. And he's not saying anything terrible. And he's being kind of transparent, to be honest. But, and I said it on Twitter, I commend him for continuing to speak to the media and talk about the Orioles plan. But the issue is that plan continues to get backtracked. Now, let me take you back to the trade deadline. The Orioles, playing good baseball, had come off a big July, were in a playoff race. And what do they do at the deadline? They trade away two of their most important players, Trey Mancini and Jorge Lopez. And I get it. Trey struggled down the stretch with the Astros. I mean, he won the ring, but didn't really help him get there too much. Jorge Lopez was bad with the Twins, started out as their closer, ended up as basically a not high leverage middle reliever by the end of the year in Minnesota. Those were not great situations. But I think a lot of that issue had to do with getting traded. I think they would have finished the season much better had they both stayed in Baltimore and maybe, just maybe, helped an Orioles team that only missed the playoffs by 3 games get to the postseason. But I've talked about that a lot. Let's stick to the Mike Elias part of it, because he had to do some damage control. After those trades, he was asked about it. He said he didn't think this team could make the postseason. Then he had to backtrack. He said, I think this team will make the postseason. He had to fly down to Texas. The Orioles were there to play the Rangers the day of the trade deadline. Talk to some of the leaders of the team about, the direction of the squad and why they traded Mancini and Lopez. And it seems like those conversations went fairly well. You'll never know exactly how they were reacted to. But then he came out to the media and said, we can't make the playoffs. And he said, basically, this offseason, there's going to be liftoff. We're going to increase the payroll, things like that. So fans got excited, and for good reason. And I get there's a lot of different interpretations of liftoff. And Nathan Ruiz, the Baltimore Sun, has done a good job of covering this week. And John Mioli in his newsletter, Maximizing Playoff Odds, has done a good job kind of sparsing out this week what all of these quotes mean. But I think it's not even as important to say what you think the meaning of liftoff is, because as Mike Elias continues to talk, he continues to backtrack on the fact that the O's are really going to go for it this offseason. Maybe he never meant that the O's would go for it this offseason. Maybe he just got out ahead of himself and he said something to try and please people, and he realized he said something that got people too excited, and now he's trying to backtrack. But he's talked about this week, not wanting to sacrifice talent in 2024 and 25 just to go to the playoffs in 2023. He's talked about wanting to add around the young guys, not necessarily block them. He's talked about, they have offers on the table, multi-year offers, but also what I've heard is, the Orioles did apparently make an offer to Jameson Taillon. I've heard that from multiple people, but from what I've heard, it wasn't exactly up to snuff, and he ended up getting a 4-year, $68 million contract with the Cubs, and I can just tell you the Orioles were nowhere close to that. So that kind of brings us to why Elias is saying what he's saying, why he continues to speak, and what kind of spot he is in with Orioles fans and with the organization. Because you can't just blame Mike Elias, because the Angelos family, John Angelos especially, is a huge issue in this as well. Not only are they not spending money, and they haven't, but they are in this giant legal battle that we've talked about. It's getting messy. The Baltimore Sun doing a good job of covering it. You can read a lot of the coverage there. I don't even know how to begin to get into the weeds of this argument between John and Louis Angelos and their mom and Peter and everything going on. But the Orioles are involved because it has to do with control of the team. And it seems like because of this lawsuit, the Orioles are kind of getting put on the back burner in terms of the day-to-day operations of the team. Now, Mike Elias is in charge of that, but the Angeloses are also in charge of giving Elias a budget. And the net worth of that family, $3 billion, they have the money. I don't care where their assets are tied up or how badly the real estate or the lawyer business is doing. I don't care. They have the money to put a competitive baseball team on the field, and they haven't done it. And now I can understand the argument, and I'm somewhat on board for what the Orioles did when Mike Elias first came in. They rebuild, they tear it down. They've done an amazing job revamping development systems, minor league coaches, technology, using sabermetrics, going into the international market, signing players there, drafting, developing, scouting. Everything has been amazing since Elias and his crew took over. But there hasn't been wins at the major league level until last year when they surprised everybody, went from 52 to 83 wins. And you would think from Elias's quotes at the deadline, they were going to add. But now as he backtracks and talks about, well, we're not going to go from 0 to 60 right now. This is what liftoff really meant. We don't want to sacrifice the future for this year. All these different things. And what it feels like to me is that Elias said something he didn't want to say at the deadline. He had to backtrack it to try and save face. And what's really happening is, because of this Angelos fight and the fact that they just seem to be bad owners, they're not giving Elias a lot of money to work with. I mean, when you factor in the arbitration numbers, the Orioles payroll is right now going to be right around 60-ish million on opening day. I wouldn't be surprised if the Angeloses have him capped somewhere around 80 million, that he can't give out more than $20 million per year in contracts for the rest of the offseason. You can't operate like that. When guys like Trey Turner are getting 11 years, $300 million, you can't operate with only $20 million to spend for a year. And yeah, that can get you one more good pitcher or one more good left-handed hitter, but that's it. So the Orioles are probably trying, at least Mike Elias is trying to spend that money in the perfect way, and it's hard. Because Taillon's getting more money. And he said, and I believe him, we've heard reports, they have multiple offers out that are multi-year deals to starting pitchers. But if the O's have a deal out to a guy, hey, here's 2 years, $30 million to come play for the O's, and another team is offering him 4 years, $70 million, what deal is he going to take? The other team. They're going to go where the money is best. So as Mike Elias continues to backtrack, and it might be because this is what he feels, it might be because the Angeloses are giving him nothing to play with, and he's got to try and find the middleman of not saying, hey, the Angeloses are giving me no money, but also not saying, let's go for it. He's trying to find the middle right now, but it's a bad look. And I think I said this on the Locked On Orioles Twitter account the other day. I think he's got to stop talking to the media for a little bit. Go into hiding, make your calls, try to make your trades, try to make your signings. Just don't speak to the media for a month or so. At least wait until the new year. Because every time he talks to Baltimore media, to national outlets, on TV, on the radio, it just gets worse and worse, the things he says. And it basically makes you feel more and more like the O's might not spend it all this offseason. And they still got a good young core, and they could still win baseball games with this current group next year. But not nearly the amount of baseball games they'll win if they bring in, at the very least, another starter and a left-handed hitter. So I think he just needs to step back a little bit because we don't know where it all fits in. Obviously, Elias came in with a vision of revamping the Orioles, and the Angeloses were on board for two reasons. One, the team was in a bad spot. They wanted to get it back to a good spot. But two, they knew for 3, 4, 5 years, Elias was going to have a very tiny payroll. And it wasn't going to cost the Angeloses basically anything to operate this baseball team at the major league level as Elias churned things through at the minor league level. But now they're back to the point where they're good again, and they should start to spend again. And the Angeloses have spent a top 10 payroll within the last decade. In the Duquette-Buck era, at best, they had the 10th highest payroll in baseball. You go back to the 90s, the Angeloses were in charge. The O's were going to the ALCS. They had the second highest payroll in baseball. They can do this. They have the money. They're choosing not to. And it's interesting to think about, again, where Elias fits in. Because, again, this was his vision, and the Angeloses bought in. But you can't think his whole vision was just keep churning through minor league guys, young guys, cheap guys. Maybe he wants to operate like the Rays do or the Guardians do. I don't want him to, but he came from the Astros where, yeah, the Astros haven't given out a ton of giant free agent contracts, but they've extended their best players at times. They have paid for guys both at the deadline and the offseason when they've needed to, and they've built an incredible team that runs a fairly high, not amazingly high, but fairly high payroll. You'd at least hope he could do that in Baltimore. That's what he was used to coming from Houston. But maybe it's an ownership group that's not giving him anything at all because they're just worried about all this bickering and fighting and suing each other. These idiotic billionaires who are just having this stupid public fight with the Orioles caught in the middle of it. And yes, Elias is not off the hook because he's buying into this. And while he can't maybe just go and sign players when he's not given the money, and maybe he can't even go make trades without the approval of the Angeloses to give up prospects for players, he's still someone who has said some bad stuff. He's not the most likable guy in the world. And he certainly isn't Dave Dombrowski, who's just coming in and going, spend, 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 let's go win a World Series. But it seems like the Angeloses might be the bigger problem here. And the other issue is, if Elias and co, they don't really sign anyone much else, the Orioles sit around 80 wins this year, or maybe they regress and they win 70-something games. And then they do it again the next year without spending. He's not going to get fired. Because what he's doing for the Angeloses is at least putting together a somewhat competitive team while costing them no money while they fight out their stupid BS among the billionaires. Mike Elias has some of the best job security in all of Major League Baseball. Of any GM, there aren't many with better job security right now because the Angeloses are bought into his plan. He's bought into the Orioles. And I know some people are worried, well, another team's going to come and take it. Unless another team offers him a lot more money, he won't leave because if he goes somewhere with expectations from the ownership and he fails, he's going to get fired. Whereas right here, his only expectation from the Angeloses seems to be keep costs low, spew some BS to the media, and keep the fans happy enough, give them that little sliver of hope that they think we're going to spend and add to this team, and then just keep developing like you're doing an amazing job of. And he can continue to do that without the Orioles getting a lot better in free agency. And they might hit some years and maybe get to the playoffs. And they might bottom out some years, just like the Rays. It's getting to a concerning point. He doesn't have the pressure on him to win, which means he doesn't have the pressure that he's going to get fired, which means he can be okay with the Angeloses just not putting money into this baseball team. So is he part of the problem? Yes. Is he all the problem? No. Because I think the biggest problem here is what's going on with the Angelos family. They need to sell. I don't know if they're going to do it, but they need to sell. Because if they don't, and they continue to own this team and go through this fight, I am really worried that at the very least, until this fight ends, they're not going to spend like they need to spend to keep up with the AL East and get this young core, which looks amazing, the pieces it needs around it to get to the playoffs and compete for a World Series. Do they share the blame? Yeah. Do the Angelos have more of it? I think they do right now. And until they show me otherwise, it's going to be concerning. And I think Elias just needs to go into the shadows a little bit, do his job. Don't talk to the media for a bit, because every time he speaks, he's probably somewhat well-meaning. And again, I commend him for going out there and continuing to take the questions. But it's just a bad look every time. And it feels like every time he speaks, he just steps in it and digs the hole even deeper and makes it worse for Orioles fans, whatever side they fall on in this argument. So if they go sign Rodón, Bassitt, whomever, Correa, this kind of all goes out the door. I don't really see it happening. I'm not panicked, but I'm a little worried. I don't like the direction with the Angeloses. So hopefully at some point, somebody can step in and buy this team. Because I think Elias is a good GM with the money from the top to really do and add to this team. But we're just almost never going to know what the restrictions are. And it leads to all these frustrations this offseason. But hopefully this weekend, maybe we'll come back on Monday here on the pod. There'll be some less frustrations. Maybe the O's will have signed a free agent. If they do, we'll get to it on Monday's episode. But if not, we're going to open up the mailbag. A mailbag Monday coming up when we return here on the pod. Send your mailbag questions via email to lockedonorioles@gmail.com. You can tweet us at lockedonorioles, DM the account. You can leave a question in the comments here on YouTube. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel as well. Or you can leave a mailbag question in the review section on iTunes. Give a 5-star rating. Give a review that is your question, and it will be answered on Monday's Mailbag Monday episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.